Often we'll see games with a heavy emphasis on strong presentation intended to disguise what is otherwise a mediocre product. Sable does not fit this description. Its jaw-dropping art style and uplifting soundtrack don't distract from, rather elevate its poignant story, exploratory gameplay loop, and deep understanding of open-world game design. I'm wonderstruck. Although it primarily entails exploration alongside some moderate puzzle solving, Sable is very much rooted in the foundations of its fruitful story. The titular character you play as is a teenage girl from a nomadic desert tribe, who finds herself caught up in a tough predicament of having to leave her settlement, embark on an adventure across the great unknown, and eventually find a permanent occupation. This adventure, categorized as a rite of passage called gliding, takes up the bulk of the game, but shockingly enough, Sable is given enough depth in the first hour and a half. While many of her character traits conveyed are instantly recognizable as those of a teenager, everything else is more symbolic. The external journey Sable must undertake cleverly serves as a parallel to her own internal journey of self-discovery. She is not only searching for a field of work, but purpose as well. This can ultimately be described as the process of growing up, a story trope that is rare to see in most video games, but effectively implemented in Sable. It's especially surprising to see this in an open world game, as they tend to struggle on the front of storytelling because they're so expansive. Often, the more you engage with one's content through completing side missions, the choppier its narrative gets. However, Sable doesn't feature any side content. Or perhaps it only features side content. Whatever the case, nothing you do feels pointless, as it all contributes to your overarching goal of choosing a profession. In order to have the option of choosing a certain profession, you need to obtain its respective mask, which can be crafted once you have 3 of a certain type of badge, given to you by completing errands. While that might not seem to be a fitting word to describe creative mission design, and truthfully, missions aren't complex, they are redeemed by the stories they portray. Although activities such as scavenging for butterflies and playing hide-and-seek aren't necessarily strong grounds for masterful storytelling, it's the slight depth given to the NPCs that provide these missions that had me fascinated. My favorite of which to talk to were the children, as they juxtapose Sable's own adolescent turmoil with youthful zest, and perhaps more notably, an ironic and ill-advised eagerness to grow up. In conversing with adults, those who have already taken up positions such as guards, cartographers, and scrappers, the roles are somewhat reversed. Sable feels inadequate, while whoever's on the other end of the conversation seems so confident and collected to her. The most intriguing exchange I had was with a missing teenage girl I was appointed to find and take home, called Lore. On your adventure, you encounter many people who have already completed their gliding, and many who are too young to begin it. From what I can recall, Lore is the only character I met who was in the process of gliding. As such, her dialogue hit a lot harder, especially since the context of you meeting her is in an attempt to strip her away from the wild and return her to her priest. It's these moments that make the game so memorable. Although there are bustling villages, Sable is more interested in the sparse lands in between. Typically, this would make a world feel uninspired, but here they're the game's best aspects. They feature gorgeous vistas, and the long stretches of unutilized land make way for a sense of calm and traversal, especially with your main means of doing so, your hoverbike. The game also features some iteration of the paraglider from Breath of the Wild, although it's not an item, rather an extended part of Sable herself. Another difference is that it doesn't take up stamina, meaning you can float across the barren land until you naturally hit the ground. Of course, the world does fulfill a purpose, it isn't entirely deserted. There are discoveries to make, many of which I didn't and others did, and vice versa. These can be deliberate facets of the game's content, or disappointingly entirely superfluous. Exploration is always gratifying, however, because no matter what you find it yourself, with little to no hand-holding. The game delivers on an extraordinary and at times imposing sense of agency. This isn't immediately noticeable, as the shortage of mechanics means there isn't much room for players to go above and beyond expectations. In fact, freedom relates much more to the world than the player in Sable. Its vast desert of Midden is desolate, which is understandable. Of course, thematically, but also in the name of exploration. Linearity is almost nowhere to be found, not only in regards to there not being blatant and annoying restrictions, but the game is practically devoid of any structure. It's amazing how items and people required for completing objectives are in the world as soon as you spawn in. You don't need to activate their respective missions. Perhaps even more impressive is the unscripted order in which you complete objectives and find parts of the world. The last place I ventured to before heading back home may have been the first for many players, and I'm sure there are entire areas I didn't even discover. Between these two bold design points that most AAA open world games are too afraid to implement, the world of Sable feels unadulterated, as if it weren't a video game at all. And yet, surprisingly, there is genuine gameplay. On your journey across Midden, you'll discover these Goliath metal creatures which contain unfortunately simplistic puzzles, which also revolve around platforming. It's worth noting that the game has free climbing, also like in Breath of the Wild, adding an extra amount of agency to the gameplay loop and especially these puzzles. It also makes the focus much more around executing the solution to one than finding out what it is, as 99% of the time, the answer is to get to the top of a structure. This also goes for most mission objectives that require finding people, who usually reside on top of towers. As you might have noticed, there isn't any combat. That in itself isn't necessarily an immediate pitfall. However, it does mean that the game has to work twice as hard to ensure every inch of its map feels purposeful, without any scattered hordes of enemies or challenges players can complete to earn weapons or health upgrades. Sadly, in this regard, Sable just seems to give up. I wouldn't go as far as to say the game should have included combat, as that might ruin the sense of tranquility. However, it does feel like something is missing. There are consistent items to obtain though, to partly rectify this issue. Many of them are artificial, such as coats of paint for your hoverbike, or new sets of clothing that don't make any real difference in the context of the gameplay. Like I mentioned, there are no health upgrades, and because this game focuses so heavily on traversal, the inclusion of stamina upgrades in the form of the little glowworms you can find just makes sense. There's also a currency called cuts, which can be used to buy bike parts and clothing, but also badges. Of course, most of the incredible content is unique, adding to the thrill of exploration, which is why the lack of overarching mechanics is acceptable. Even in spite of my practically uninterrupted praise thus far, I can't fully recommend this game. Not yet, at least. And that is for one reason in particular. While I was personally able to overlook it, I imagine many won't be so forgiving of the rampant bugginess. I won't elaborate on it too much, but there are glitches present in every area of the game, from AI to music to graphics to movement. It tends to feel unpolished. So if you want to get the most out of your experience, I'd wait until a few patches come out. Even aside from whether or not you can tolerate the bugs, this isn't going to be a game for everyone. You could argue that the world is too barren, the puzzles too mundane, the gameplay loop too simplistic. These would all be legitimate complaints, so I imagine this game will continue to receive mixed reception. And yet, plainly put, between the deeply personal story and ingenious innovations upon the open world structure, this was exactly what I was hoping for.